I'll just get started. Welcome back to the Black Dog Collective podcast. I'm your host, Clarice Green, and we have here Angela from the South LLC, the co-host of the podcast The N-Word, as well as Pauline Estanti here with me. So recently, most of us voted in the 2024 presidential election with Harris and Trump as lead Democrat and Republican candidates, respectively. And today we're bringing you a different way to think about the election results from Angela Peoples. And as I said, Angela is the co-owner and CEO of the South LLC and co-host of the podcast, The N-Word. The South is a space that centers Black culture to reimagine, redefine, and redistribute political power. She is a fierce activist and political analyst, and her critique is grounded in Black feminist thought and liberation. So welcome to the podcast, Angela. Can you tell us a little bit about how you are doing, what's on your mind these days, and how did you get to where you are?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Clarice, and it's really nice to meet you, Pauline. How am I doing? I'm doing okay, all things considered. It's not lost on me that we are um, just a few days away from the second inauguration of a person who is, in word and in language and in deed, very anti Black, Native, Indigenous, queer, people of color, women experiences. And so, and it's also just, and even though we're bumping up against a moment that feels familiar, it's also just so much has changed in the last 8 years. And so I'm definitely sitting with and reflecting on that. I'm also just thinking a lot about how much influence the wealthy have over our day to day. I'm a pretty avid might not be the right word, but I'm an active, let's say the active TikTok user. And, so we're just a couple of days from when a ban on TikTok is supposed to go into effect here in the US. And again, there's all this back and forth about depending on which news reports you hear about um, this company is maybe it will be banned or the ban won't be upheld, or this billionaire might buy it and then, or another billionaire. And that's just one part of, there's many moments where we're watching, people who, you run and profit off of things that we use every day, whether it's Google or Meta or Amazon or what have you, have so much sway in this current administration and about to have even more administrations or more sway. So I'm just thinking about that and really interested to see like how at the same time inequality is the worst that it's ever been. And so just really interested to see like what shifts come from that and all of the changes that have happened in the last 8 years.
Thank you for that, like for your response, because that's something that we had questions on within BTC, the Black Dog Collective. We were talking about really the impact and change of democracy over time for the US,
Mhm.
especially the fact that the US isn't considered a full democracy by the Economist Intelligent Unit Democracy Index. And so I was wondering, like, based on that, what do you continue to find weak about the democracy in the US if you want to expand on the kind of oligarchy things that we're seeing, as well as like, do you think all roads are coming back to white supremacy and the weakness of racial superiority complexes being like at the forefront of that? Things like that. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one, I think it's always hard to we have to couch the reality, the idea that the United States is a democracy in the context or in with the reality that it's only in, for the first 100+ years of this country's existence, um, did not have right, like the majority of the population didn't have the right to vote, right? It was actually a very much smaller number of folks that have access to vote. And so even though that's increased over time with, more people getting the franchise, the reality is that we always have to think about this country as a democracy. But yeah, I think that two things I'll say. One is a democracy is intended for there to be one person, one vote. It's intended for the majority of the people, the opinion of the majority of people to actually win the day, to have a sway. But we don't have the impact of laws that are repealing things like the Voting Rights Act, the impact of voter suppression, particularly in the South, that fuels low voter turnout. And we know that the majority of people that live in southern states are Black people. And so there is intention there. And I live in Florida, and it is so hard to feel like you have a representation in the majority of people that live in Florida, our opinions, what we want, what's actually good for us. Well, even what we think is good for us is actually being reflected in the halls of power because of things like gerrymandering, where they cut the voting precincts and lines so that they're very racialized and politicized, or laws that make it harder for people that live in certain areas, for students or for poor people to vote or have access to voting booths. All of this is racialized and intended to, and the outcome is, whether or not it's the intention, the outcome is that people that look like me, that look like you, that are actually people who are our family members that live in communities like the ones that we live in, don't actually get a chance to either have a say, or even if they, through the voting process, through the democracy, or even if they do, it's actually, even if they do have a chance to vote, because of the way that the laws are structured with white supremacy as their foundation, it makes it so that it doesn't even matter. And we haven't even opened up and talked about the role of money in elections, right? And so we're in a situation where Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, spent, a little bit of chump change for him, right? It's like a tip for him, or whatever, like 250, I think it was $250 million, something like that, to influence the election, right? And so I certainly don't have that type of money. And so the idea that there's no limits on what one person can put into paying for an election means that that person can pay for whoever gets into office. And so I think at the baseline, there was a lot of talk, from people on the Democrat side on this last election cycle, that like, we have to vote to save democracy. We have to vote to save democracy. And it just felt a little bit disingenuous, because like, are we actually voting to save democracy? Is that even going to happen if we vote and we are voting in a system that doesn't have any checks and balances on money, and doesn't actually prioritize in giving people the options and the opportunities to vote?
I mean, like, at least touching upon what you said, like voter suppression specifically being very prominent in the South with gerrymandering, with the history of gerrymandering, and also the culture of the South, or at least Republicanism in the South specifically, and how even for people who are trying, for people of, excuse me, for people of color who are trying to get to the ballots, who are trying to vote, kind of being threatened in a sense by
Mm-hmm.
other Republicans, or just like, yeah, just Republicans in general, threatening them at the ballots, even though it's technically illegal, or they're wearing MAGA merch or anything MAGA related, or just anything with threatening iconography towards um marginalized groups, just preventing them from going to those ballots. And when we were talking on the topic of voter suppression, it comes up a lot during elections, but it's not
Yeah,
something you hear a lot about after the elections, unless it's something that was rigged, especially something that we saw January 6th of last year. So
right.
ballot boxes being burned, missing ballots in specific countries. I guess could you speak more on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point that you make around voter intimidation is a really good one. It happened. One of the things that I did in 2020 and 2020 Two, is I ran campaigns to help organize folks to turn out to protect folks at the ballot box, to turn out to be actively engaged in strategies to make sure that people who were trying to intimidate voters or steal ballot boxes or not certify results or throw out certain ballots, whatever, to try to organize people within community organizations to be prepared to respond to that. And so, the voter intimidation it is real. And it's not just at the ballot box. It's also, when you hear stories about if my candidate, if XYZ candidate doesn't win, then their supporters are going to riot or there's going to be an increased violence, right? We literally had the person who's about to be the president say, well, if I don't win, you all better watch out. Like months, days, weeks before the election, like that is, and we saw them, make good on that promise in 2020 and in 2021. And so if I'm somebody that is on the fence about voting, or I just kind of don't, I'm not political and I don't really see the impact because my representative, I don't feel like they are responsive to me, and I don't feel like they're gonna like if somebody says, if I don't win, then there's gonna be violence. It's like, I'm out of here. I don't either. That doesn't encourage you. That's intimidating in and of itself. It doesn't always just happen at the ballot box. And I think, people do it to young people all the time on college campuses, trying to take away their location or try to say even the smallest thing of like, well, you shouldn't vote here because you're not from here. Well, I live here. I live here. I pay taxes here. I contribute to the economy here. I am just here, right? I should be able to have a say here. Even those little statements, they can have an intimidating effect on folks.
And I was even thinking, like, some of the intimidation as well. And this is kind of also in reflection of your Inward podcast episode. I believe it was episode, I want to say it was 7 or 8, when you were talking about like people don't know how to research and like but also you were mentioning like people also don't have the time. And I was wondering like, one of our students were actually wondering if people even want to do the research or if they even like, I think that was a question. If like people, like, a question to you would be like, have you been seeing people want to know and not like, yeah, kind of be on the up and up about like who's supposed to be like their legislator or like their senator, things like that.
Yeah. Well, first I'll say thanks for listening to the N-word podcast. Appreciate it so much. I will say it's an interesting question because I feel like there's a bit of like balance to or nuance to strike because on the one hand, like I firmly but like a lot of times people in like social justice spaces will say we're too what we're saying is too complicated or people don't get what we're not using plain language. And sometimes I'm kind of like, I think people are smarter than we might give them credit for. It's a matter of like if what we're saying actually is interesting to them or if they feel like it's less about whether they can understand it and more like if it's relevant to their lives. And I think unfortunately what we've seen in the last honestly 20 years, maybe even longer, is that government doesn't actually, people are not seeing improvements from the government in their day-to-day lives. And so that doesn't, and then that translates to either I can't, if I do have a thing that I need from my government or my elected official, I can't get it, or whatever I need, they're not the ones that I can get it from. And so why do or even if I ask for them to, if I do vote, if I am engaged, I don't get what I'm needing back. There's no response to me. Like I think that, and it goes back to some of the money and politics stuff, some of the like, this word that more and more people are saying, oligarchy, which I'm sure you all are steeped in it because you're students now, and this is the type of thing that people learn when they're in school is about oligarchies, hopefully. And so, but this idea that like wealthy people are having an outsized role and say in our lives and in our policy and what happens in our country, I think that, yeah, I think that, so I go back and forth. Like, I do think it's true that some people, the sum of what, is the urgency that people share about why it's important to vote, the impact of your vote, the power of the vote, and why you need to be informed in how you're voting. I think that it can go over people's heads, or we just can miss people sometimes. And I do think that it's true that some people are just checked out, and like, we could have a conversation about like whether or not we should blame them or somebody else, but I think it's more, to me, it's more relevant and important to talk about that people are checked out and how do we check them back in versus being like, well, whose fault is it? And are they checked out because they're bad people, or are they checked out because something else happens? Like, they're just checked out. So let's actually figure out how we can bring them back in. Um, and then there was something else. I just think that there's an important bit to, I think we're also seeing a lot of people that we can't negate the fact that misinformation is very much a thing and people are being lied to, right? People are being fed lies, literal lies. I think that a great example is all of the discussion about trans athletes, trans people in bathrooms, the all of the fear mongering that conservatives used to against targeting trans people in this past election. And the truth is that trans people make up a really, really small portion of the population. And trans children, even more so, make a smaller portion of the population. And so nobody trans is coming for you. Nobody trans is like trying to take, like, that's not happening. But because of people's indoctrination with white supremacy and how patriarchy and gender norms and gender binary, I should say, are a part of that white supremacy ideology, people were very susceptible to the misinformation that made them think that if they voted for one candidate, that they were voting for a invasion of trans experiences. And that scares people, that's different than what people are familiar with. And it's an easy way to intimidate folks. But so I think that like we also have to recognize that it's many things, right? It's not that everything is too confusing for people to understand. It's also not that people just don't want to do the research. It's also not just that people are being fed misinformation. It's all of those things together at one time that's really creating a perfect storm. And also people's needs are not getting met in very real ways. And that makes people, which is by design, by the way. And so people's needs are not getting met intentionally. And so that also makes people more likely, I think, to be, open to these ideas, to believe things that just like kind of don't really make sense if you just take 1 or 2 seconds to think critically.
Following that, do you think, I guess, the advent of TikTok like either helped or hurt that, I guess, feeling of either being informed or like promoting people to be more informed about like their situation, what they can do in their communities, or
Mm-hmm.
more so like harmed in the sense of like how many communities were formed from TikTok, like the manosphere, the rise of the manosphere essentially being really promoted through TikTok's algorithm. So I'm not really sure what I'm not exactly sure what the statistics would be from TikTok,
Yeah.
but what would you say?
I think it's okay. So I think it's the algorithms. Yes, the algorithms are they favor conflict, right? They don't favor harmony, right? We share things that piss us off, not really things that we love. Although I think that TikTok is a little bit TikTok's an interesting case because it's just it's so political right now. But I think that there is a lot to be said about how a lack of awareness around the rise of you know, these communities on social platforms, because it's not just TikTok, it's Twitch, it's Reddit, it's Discord, these gaming, they're like, this is just a gaming platform. But if you look at the chat, they're like talking about all sorts of like sexist, racist, anti-trans, type of language. And so I think that I think part of it is also due to just the complete like ineptitude and lack of awareness that our leaders have around the digital economy and how stories move on virtual platforms, on social media, and the lack of regulation, right? Like, when's the last time they passed a law about information, how it moves on social media? The last time they did was just to ban TikTok. And the truth is that, like, you ban TikTok, another one's going to emerge, which we're seeing now happen on TikTok, or people are just going to go to one of these other platforms, which are also still toxic and fueling, using these conflict heavy algorithms and so on and so forth to like. So I think it's less to me about this happened because of TikTok and more to me about like, this is the fact that misinformation was able to flourish and like these really toxic communities were able to like, fester and grow and explode. Even on places like WhatsApp, right? Where we recently found out that there's a 70,000 group chat of people talking about how to do, sexual violence against women. And so like, I think that it's indicative to me, it's just another example of how our priorities are misaligned and why I understand why people might feel like their elected leaders are out to lunch and are not, and that are not happening. The other thing is I think people feel a sense of community in these spaces that they don't feel in other circumstances, and that really fuels the desire to kind of dig into your little hole and be in a manosphere or be in a sort of more like, there's another one that is not as well known and is not as much in the news now, but it's like sort of this parents' rights ecosystem that really is all about like banning books and banning social emotional learning at schools and targeting trans teachers or LGBTQ flags at school. This is another kind of movement that grew online in some of these different digital communities, and that has had really toxic impacts on our social structure.
Thank you so much for your response. And um because I really appreciate the detail from which you went from talking about online and the shifts to the policies and practices as well, and beliefs that we're seeing manifest today. Because another question we had, especially you being in Florida and us being in Indiana, where we're seeing the onset of so many anti-DAI laws, or just anti, like, certain books or certain theories or certain just programs and jurisdictions in general within like communities on campus. We were wondering what you think, especially as we see this onset of Project 2025 and dismantling certain things. What do you think about the future impact and implications of what could possibly happen on those fronts? I know you mentioned kind of socially what you were considering would go on, but also I'm wondering about culturally, and then how that, especially how we're seeing culture influence like political things, like political nature of things.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I really like this question. I mean, I want to say two things. First, I think it's important for us to recognize that the anti-CRT movement, the book bans, the changing of AP history, the attack on DEI, the anti-woke agenda, is a backlash to our movements. It is a backlash to the power that Black people, that Black feminists, that people of color, that undocumented folks, that queer and trans folks, that working class folks have built over the last 20 years. The Black Lives Matter movement, Occupy Wall Street, Standing Rock, I could go on, right? The undocumented but unafraid movement. These are this is like white supremacy's last grasp on trying to stop the inevitable. It is inevitable that this country is going to be a quote majority minority, or as a lot of folks say, like to say now, the global majority is going to start to be the dominant race in this country. So I think it's important for, especially for young people, to recognize that this isn't happening in a vacuum. And it's also not because we're powerless. It's because we're powerful. It's because we turned out for a whole summer, 20 million people for a whole summer. And even though there was a pandemic, even though we had to wear masks and we were all afraid we were going to get each other sick and maybe kill each other, we turned out for months, for weeks and months on end, for racial justice, to change how this country treats people as opposed around race and class. That it didn't not happen. It totally happened, and they are aware of our power. The same thing happened not last summer, but 2 summers, or maybe it was this earlier summer. I don't know. Time is a little weird right now. But when so many college students turned out in support of the Palestinian people, and to stop the war in Gaza, right? Like, we are powerful. They see it, they know it, and they're scared. And so they're trying to like claw back as much as they can in as many ways as possible. And so all of our responses, especially moving forward, because more movements will pop up, more people will take action. We need to know that it's a backlash, and not because we're powerful, not because we're powerless. And the other thing that I think is important to note is that I think that, we've just made too much progress. Like, if they were going to try to like claw all of this back in the 90s, maybe, but we have the internet now, right? There's no people. I'm literally talking to you. Y'all are miles away, or hundreds, probably thousands of miles away. And we are sharing thoughts. We're sharing ideas. Like, we're actually, even though we're isolated more so in person, and that is a thing that we need to try to adapt as a culture because of social media, right? Like, we need to figure out, how do we rebalance away from like some of the more toxic things about social media, allow the good things to be the good things, but like readjust away from the things that are not so great. But we have the internet now. We're actually way more connected, and even though there's a proliferation of misinformation because of these sites that are profit driven, we also can fact check each other. That's why we need to grab the information that we're hearing online, not ignore it, but then take it offline and actually be like, I heard this. Is this true? Did you hear this? No, that's not true. Right. I didn't think that was true. I didn't think that could be possible. Like, we need to be able to have those conversations with each other and not just take everything in from the internet as if it's 100% fact, because we know that it's not. It's profit driven, which means it's always going to be, and here you should always view it with a little bit of a skepticism. But yeah, I think that culturally, I'm really interested to see what happened, because like, yes, there are, very, very wealthy Black people, more wealthy potentially. I don't know the numbers, like proportionately wise. Like, I don't actually know if there are more wealthy Black people now than there were during Reconstruction. I'm sure numbers wise, but I mean, proportionately, like in terms of the population size. I don't know, that could be true or not, but there are more people that have status. There are more Black people in office. And so like, there are more Black people in suite seats and in CEOs. So like, even though you see people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk trying to do their tough white guy thing on TV, like, it's Black girl magic. We've already been here. We've already done that. Like, sorry, that's over now. Like, like, go, like you're weird, bro. You know what I mean? So I think that there's going to be a little bit of those moments where like people are like, what do you think this is? Like, we've made so much, we've made enough progress that you cannot push us out of every single space. And I don't just mean Black people, right? I literally mean those of us who this country was founded on the backs of and not necessarily for. We've come too far we've infiltrated enough, right? And we can certainly have a conversation about you know, um, the elitism amongst wealthy people of color and the erasure of indigenous experiences and what needs to be done by all of us to be in right relationship with the indigenous people of this land. We can talk about but all of that is a conversation that the meta we are gonna have and will be having and are already having. And the wealthy white people that are doing their best to oppress us they're just not going to succeed. There will be, and don't get me wrong, I'm not naive to say that there will not be a lot of harm, there will not be a lot of shifts, that inequality won't be exacerbated over the next 4 or 5, 10 years. I think that that is very true, but I also think that culturally, even financially, and certainly politically, there's too much. We've gotten into the walls just enough that they're not gonna. We're gonna be able to fight back in some really significant and interesting ways. And like I said, I think this is very much the last grasp of white supremacy dominant culture. They're flailing in very unattractive ways. And we all see it happening on our screens. And people will resist. They are resisting, and the state will crumble. And those of us who are also in touch with our ancestors, are on working on having a better relationship with the earth, are working on having a better relationship with consumption and with each other and with ourselves. We're gonna last. We'll be here. Our children will be here. Our legacy will be here. And that old white maleness, it's gone. It's been gone. This is just the residuals, if you will.
That was beautiful, and I appreciate your response and everything and being a part of this podcast today. And I was gonna say what you were reminding me of is there's this quote, and I was like, I should share it, but it was the impossible attracts me, Sun Ra said, because everything possible has been done in the world and it changed. And I was just like, yeah. And I was like, no, for real. And I was just gonna ask, our last question would be if you had anything you wanted to say about the more important conclusions that you find the collective should also continue to draw. I feel like you listed so many already, but as we approach inauguration, but also the new year, is there anything maybe even what you're doing? It doesn't have to be for us. It could be something hey, this is what I'm doing. And yeah.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you inviting me on your podcast. I am grateful that you're communicating to folks about these topics, that you're creating space for people in your community to have these conversations. That's exactly what needs to be happening. I would say, I think that one of the things that I just feel really, really deeply post this election, or the 2024 election, is that we really have to get serious about interrogating white supremacy and white supremacy culture, especially how it shows up in us, right? I think that there is, for people who understand white supremacy, which is not enough people, but people who do understand white supremacy, there's oftentimes a instinct to think about on the institutional level, on the societal level. But the truth is that it's an ideology that's been kind of frankly, that we've been brainwashed into through since our schooling, right? If you go to school in the United States, if you went to elementary school in the United States, you likely, know the song "I'm Proud to Be an American," where at least I know I'm free. This is the propaganda that we were given in our elementary, in our education system. And this is also true for people outside of the United States. It just looks a little bit differently. But we have to really get serious about unlearning that stuff, seeing how it shows up in ourselves, in our day to day, and the decisions that we make, and what and who we sit next to, and what things we click on, and which people we think are worthy of a wave or a nod, which people we can just ignore, which conversations we can check out of because it doesn't have to do with us, right? Like these are little ways that white supremacy, world domination culture shows up and informs how we move in the world. And it's really important that we do what we can to be interrogating that within ourselves, within our relationships with each other. It shows up in how, how we treat each other in our romantic relationships, in our friendship relationships, our jobs, where we live, all of that stuff, right? And so if we're going to be prepared to respond to and rebuild out of the ashes that the white supremacists, the white nationalists are burning down right now, like we need to be prepared to not be walking into that rebuild with white supremacy on the brain. We need to be doing the work now to unlearn it so that we can start to be in community with each other in ways that don't reflect the toxic behaviors that that we've all been raised on and that white supremacy wants us to double down on. And so like that's a lot of what we talk about on the N-Word podcast is how on a the different decisions that you can make, the ways that you can move to start to like unlearn this stuff about gender, about money, about parenting, all types of things. And so I think that like that's part of what I'm in practice of is really starting to name in more and more ways and demonstrate how I'm trying to unlearn white supremacy in my day-to-day life, how I'm trying to let it go, how I'm trying to like put new things back in and like talk about it because it's not easy and it's not like you're a sheep, you do all, you like it's literally just it's like the soup that we're all swimming in or the ocean that we're not swimming in soup or the ocean that we're all swimming in and like you have to actually make an active decision to swim in the other direction and know that the current is going to try to push you back. It's going to try to push you back and you're going to have to return. You're going to have to go back again and swim in another direction. And so I think that that's the work for all of us to do. We do that in community. We do that by being vulnerable with each other, with ourselves, by being honest about what's coming up for us and how we feel like, this stuff is showing up or not showing up and who we want to be. And then actually making choices to be and show up as those people on everyday small choices, big choices on every single day to try to move in a way that decenters the ideas and the behaviors of white supremacy and white supremacy culture and takes us back to our indigenous cultures, to how our ancestors moved, to the West African cultures that so many of us came from as well. I think that that's an important, and the Caribbean cultures as well. Like there's all of that is these truths are in us and the opportunity to like unlearn and then relearn is a gift. It's painful, but I think it's an important gift that more people need to be digging into right now so that we can be prepared for the fight and for the rebuild.
Thank you. That was wonderful, amazing. I really appreciate it. And to our
Yay!
listeners, thank you for listening and subscribe to the N-Word podcast. And most importantly, keep thinking because it's always bigger than you. Until next time, we're the Black Dot Collective.